Hi there, and welcome to today's episode of Eclipses in History. Today, we bring a great historian to talk about one of the most important eclipses of the United States American history. It's the Great Eclipse of 1878. It was observed in Wyoming and Colorado, and there were many people who filled lots of hotels, and even the famous inventor Thomas Edison was there. There was also a pioneering woman who was Maria Mitchell, and Maria Mitchell was the first female astronomer scientist to join the prestigious American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So, uh, today we are going to interview Dr. Steve Ruskin. And Dr. Steve Ruskin is an award winning historian with a PhD in history and philosophy of science from the University of Notre Dame. He is the author of the book America's First Great Eclipse. He also writes science fiction. He's a Colorado native. Oh, great book.
Sorry.
And he loves hiking in the Rocky Mountains. So, welcome, Dr. Steve. And
Thank you
by the
so much.
way, can I call you Steve from now on during the interview?
Yes. Please call me Steve. I'm a doctor, I suppose, but I don't expect you to refer to me that way. It's just fine to call me Steve.
And Steve, would you like to? You showed your book, and I'm sure that our viewers are curious to know a little bit about it. Can you tell a little bit about your book?
Sure. Yeah, the book you were referring to that I wrote about, just in 2017 for the eclipse that we had in the United States back in 2017 was called America's First Great Eclipse, and that was the eclipse of 1878. And I wrote an article about it many years ago and decided to turn it into a book. But that's because I live in Colorado, as you mentioned. I'm
Hmm.
from this is where I was born, and I have a PhD in history of science. And so the two kind of combined when I discovered that there had been this amazing eclipse in 1878 that brought people from the east coast of the United States to the Rocky Mountains. Um, I was fascinated by it, and I decided to look into it more, and it ended up being an article and then a book, and that's what we're going to be discussing today.
Oh, that's excellent. And so let's get started with the questionnaire for our interview. And I hope you enjoy being here. And
Yes.
it's our second episode. And each each episode brings a very interesting story of eclipses through the course of history. And I know that this story we are going to tell today, that we are going to share your knowledge today, is a very interesting one because I I was doing some research on this eclipse, and it says that it was during the 1878 eclipse that the United States began to be prominent as a competing with Europe in science, because before that it was said that it was the Europeans who had the leadership in science. Can you comment a little bit about this beginning of the United States as a competitor of Europe in science?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's correct. In really until the 19th century, Europe did dominate. Astronomy was one of the key sciences that goes back to ancient times, of course, but was really developed in Europe. But what was interesting is that up until the 19th century, astronomy was largely a positional science, by which I mean astronomers were mostly concerned, with a few exceptions, of rather where the stars were, where say the moons of Jupiter were, all for the purposes of navigation, right? Really up until the 19th century. And then a little bit before that, you had people like William Herschel, who was kind of an outlier looking at nebulae and kind of wondering what they were. But in the 19th century, astronomy shifts. They had what was called the new astronomy. We would call it astrophysics. But astronomers in the 19th century were more concerned, or began to be more to question not just where things were and focus on position, but what things were. What was the sun made of? What sorts of elements were the stars composed of? And they could do this with new technologies like spectroscopes, electromagnetic spectroscopes, where they could analyzed light and determined what sort of elements stars and the sun contained. And so what you had was a shift, and Americans began to really take the lead in the second half of the 19th century in this new astronomy, to the point that the Europeans, such as Norman Lockyer, the great British astronomer, was actually amazed. He said, I can't imagine what the golden age of science is going to be like in America when they are so far ahead of us in so many regards. So really the 19th century, to answer your question, is where the Americans began to sort of, I don't know if take the lead, because it was a very collaborative effort, but they began to become equal with, in many cases, and in some fields better than the Europeans, in this new field of astrophysics, or the new astronomy.
Because Europeans they were better also in music, arts, architecture, and many other areas besides sciences. And sciences was one of the areas where they were world leaders at that time.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I mean, Europe was always sort of the culture and the society and the science, the source of science that Americans look back to. But I think the 19th century, again, is where you start to see things begin to shift.
All right, Steve. Now let's go to our second question, which is the total eclipse of 1878 was one of the first scientific events in American history to really capture the public imagination on a national level. Can you tell us why?
Yes, of course. 1878, if we'll do a little history lesson, the Civil War in the United States, which had, dominated the country and divided it in the 1860s, ended in 1865. So by 1878, the country had begun to heal. The United States, of course, I know we've got viewers watching from all over, and you're from Brazil, but the United States is a very big country. In 1878, pretty much everything west of the Mississippi was quite sparsely populated, if at all. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. The Union Pacific and the Central Pacific kind of being united at Promontory Summit in Utah. The point with both of those sorts of things and all the other things that were happening at the time was that America, the United States, sort of became united again and whole. We weren't at war. The economy was better. You had an increasing middle class. And so when word got out in the 1876, 77 that there was going to be this eclipse, astronomers, of course, knew in advance and were preparing. But in early 1878, with the railroad, with people being able to access the Rocky Mountains, new towns like Colorado Springs and Denver giving access to the Rocky Mountains, people thought, hey, this could be a fun, expedition to not only, and when I say people, I mean non-astronomers, sort of your average person thought, hey, the Rockies were kind of legendary already. It was a great sort of epic, legendary destination spot or vacation spot that not many people had seen yet. So the railroads and money and peace all gave Americans an opportunity to travel. And the eclipse of 1878 was a big draw. It also occurred in July, on July 29th. So it was a good time, the height of summer. So that's why it became a very popular event. And so in the end, hundreds, if not thousands of people came to see it. And little towns, Denver was still a small town. Colorado Springs was very small. The hotels were filled up. People were sleeping on cots, on billiard tables. In Colorado Springs, one hotel owner went out and started renting out the horse stalls, the livery stables, because they had so many people coming, they couldn't fit them all. And it was pretty funny. They didn't have VRBO or Expedia or any way to book in advance. So.
And I read that the weather was supposed to be bad during the eclipse, so it was a surprise that thank God everything went fine and the eclipse could be observed.
Yeah, this is true. Weather is always a concern for any eclipse. Even now, it doesn't matter how sophisticated your equipment is. If a cloud covers the sun during totality, what can you do, right? Unless you fly above it in a plane or something. But yes, they were, Colorado weather can be quite hit or miss in the summer, just because you have storms rolling through. And the same thing with, excuse me, with all the Rocky Mountains. So the weather ended up being perfect, though, on that day in 1878.
Okay, excellent. Now, Steve, let's move to our next question. Why were Americans willing to travel so far to see the eclipse of 1878? And what could they expect when they got to their destination? Did women go as well as men?
Yeah. So yes, um, as you know, I sort of mentioned just a minute ago, this was a real exciting chance for people to visit the West when, and in an easy way. You know, they could get from the East Coast or you know, sort of the Appalachian area to the Rocky Mountains in just a couple of days now. So they didn't have to spend weeks or months traveling by wagon. So it was a great opportunity and an easy opportunity to get to the Rockies to see this eclipse. Um, so that was one of the things that really excited them, just the ease of travel and knowing that there were some, you know, some reasonably decent towns and cities there to sort of um, meet their needs in terms of, you know, food and shelter and that sort of thing. And yes, absolutely, many women came, and we'll be talking about, as you said, Maria Mitchell, who's absolutely fascinating. But women came, some came, you know, most, you know, traveled with husbands or family members. But Maria Mitchell, who we'll talk about, like I said, traveled just her and her female students. And it was pretty interesting. So.
And we also know that at that time in the United States, I don't know if only in the United States or in other parts of the world, um, women only travel unescorted.
Perhaps. I mean, there were definitely examples of women traveling, you know, on their own, and Maria Mitchell again is one of them. And we can. Do you want to talk about her now, or wait a little bit until we talk about her?
Uh, Either way.
Yeah, I mean, well, we'll get to that in a second because I know you have your questions, and I don't want
Mhm.
to sort of um, mess up your timetable. But yeah, I mean, regardless, women did come, and some of them came on their own or in groups. But yeah, they still usually were probably escorted. Um, that was how things were still done then.
Yes. Okay. Now, we also want to know about Maria Mitchell now. Who was Maria Mitchell? What was her significance to American astronomy, and in particular, the education of women scientists?
Yeah, well, Maria Mitchell, and I think we wanted to talk briefly about some of the other astronomers, but I'll start with Maria Mitchell, and then I'm going to make a list, just give you a list of some of the other big names who were there. But Maria Mitchell
Hmm.
was what she, I mean, she's very well known in American history as a pioneer in the sciences because she was a woman. She had a lot of firsts. She was the first American woman to discover a comet, and this was in 1847. She was, I'm sorry, 1845, I believe. She was only about 30 years old. She was only the third woman in history to ever discover a comet, in fact.
Hmm.
The other two being the great Carolyn Herschel and a German woman named Maria Kirsch, I believe. So that gave her a sort of fame on her own. If she had done nothing else in her life, discovering a comet would have sort of cemented her name in history. But she went on to work for the Nautical Almanac Office as a calculator. That means someone who calculates the
Hmm.
positions of stars mathematically. Um, she became the first female professor of astronomy at the first all women's degree granting institution, which was Vassar College in New York. And so that was also a first. And then, as you mentioned earlier, she became the first fellow in both the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and I believe the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Not the first female member, but the first female fellow, which was sort of a higher position. So, bottom line, she did quite a bit for women, or for the education of women in her life. And she led by example too, because she discovered a comet. She contributed to the sciences. She was an excellent mathematician. Her father had been a teacher, and he made, you know, she had brothers and sisters, and he taught them all equally. And so, yeah, she was quite spectacular.
And yes, the other question was that you said was who were some of the astronomers who traveled to observe the eclipse? So you talked about Maria Mitchell, so the other astronomers.
Right. Yeah, and I think, you know, it's important to know, and we'll sort of wrap up with some discussion of why the 1878 eclipse was significant for the history of astronomy. But just to give you kind of a list of the who's who of the astronomers who were there, it really was in 1878. Uh, you the All the most notable astronomers of the day made it out to the Rocky Mountains to see the eclipse, from Wyoming through Colorado and down into Texas, even down to Dallas. But these included Samuel Langley, who's well known in the United States as an aviation pioneer. Langley Air Force Base is named after him. He was also the third secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. He went to the top of Pikes Peak in 1878 at 14,000 feet. That's well over 4,000 meters. And he was, I think, possibly the person who had who at that point in history had observed an eclipse from the highest point, higher than anyone else. I have no proof of that, but that's just my guess. So there was Simon Newcomb from the U.S. Nautical Almanac Office, James Watson from Detroit Observatory, Lewis Swift, who had discovered more comets and almost as many nebulae as anyone in history, other than William Herschel. Asaph Hall and his wife, a lot of these astronomers brought their wives with them, to answer your earlier question. Asaph Hall from the U.S. Naval Observatory came, and just the year before, in 1877, he discovered the two moons of Mars. Henry Draper, who was a pioneer in astrophotography and spectroscopy, he came with his wife. And of course, Thomas Edison came as well. He's an inventor, not so much an astronomer. And then to round it off, there were many European astronomers, but these included Etienne Trouvelot from France and J. Norman Lockyer, the well-known scientist who not only founded the journal Nature, which still exists today and is arguably one of the most prestigious of all these scientific journals. And Lockyer also discovered the element helium just 10 years before in 1868 at an eclipse in India. So that's a long list. I don't expect everyone to remember it, but it's important to note that this really was a who's who of world astronomers at this point.
And for example, Thomas Edison, the main reason Thomas Edison was there was because he wanted to show to the world that he was not only an inventor, but also a scientist.
Yes and no. We can talk about Edison. Do you want to talk about Edison now or about Maria
We can
Mitchell?
talk about it now.
Okay, let's talk about. So Edison's very interesting because you're right. He was absolutely hands down one of the most brilliant inventors well, certainly of his time, arguably the most brilliant inventor and possibly of all time because he was just so prolific. He did not come out in 1878 to observe like with a telescope. He was not that sort of observer. What he did do was create a device called a tasimeter. And I'm going to spell it Tasimeter. I think it's tasimeter, not tasimeter, but I'm going to call it tasimeter. And I'll be willing to be stand corrected. But it was a very sensitive device, or a device for detecting heat. Very sensitive device. And he had been requested by others like Samuel Langley, who was going up to Pikes Peak, because what they wanted to do was try to get a reading on the solar corona. So they were trying to figure out, believe it or not, back then, not everyone was sure that the corona was from the sun in 1878. There was some speculation that it would still be that what the sun was doing was illuminating an atmosphere of the moon, and that's what the corona was. Now, not everyone believed that, but there were arguments for both sides. So one thing that Edison was going to do is create this device called a tasimeter, which was a highly sensitive device, and he was going to turn it on the corona and try to get a reading on the temperature, right, to prove that the corona was from the sun. But of course, it was Thomas Edison, and he loved publicity. So when he left his lab and as he made his way west, he observed in Rawlins, Wyoming. He made all these stops, and the press came, and he loved the press, and he showed off his device, and everyone was really excited. And he was, that was the sort of science he was going to do. But he spent so much time on his little press tour that by the time he got to Rawlins, Wyoming, he was like a day before the eclipse, I think. And Rawlins was not a big town, a few shacks, a small hotel. He got the last room in the hotel, and he had to set up his observing in a chicken coop. There's rumors, and I'm not sure if this story is true, but that during the eclipse, when the sun, disappeared, the chickens all thought, hey, it's nighttime, so we're going to go back. And there's this probably apocryphal story that during the eclipse, he was assaulted by all these chickens coming back to roost. But spoiler alert on his tasimeter did not actually work all that well. It was just too sensitive, and he wasn't able to get useful readings, and he ended up turning the patents over to the public domain so anyone could work with it. But that's what Thomas Edison did. And then he went on to California on the new transcontinental rail and did a speaking tour there as well and did some tourism. But regardless, his fame was such that it brought a tremendous, it brought even more attention to to the eclipse of 1878. And
Mhm.
everyone loved having Edison there. So
Yes, he was kind of an icon there.
he was, absolutely.
Okay, very good. So let's move on to our next question. Um, Tell us more about how Maria Mitchell led students to observe the great eclipse of 1878 near Denver, Colorado.
Absolutely. So yes, Maria Mitchell, as we were discussing already, is such sort of an inspiring character or figure to women, especially in the sciences, as an early American pioneer. So 1878, she was getting close. She was quite old at this point. I shouldn't say quite old, but she was in her 70s, I believe. And she was teaching at Vassar College. What she ended up doing, and this kind of goes to the other questions about women traveling alone, she decided she was going to lead uh, an expedition consisting just of her former students. I don't think any of the students that joined her were her current students, but she had 5 other students, all female, and they traveled together. She and one of them left Boston. They picked up another one, I believe, in Cincinnati, and then a fourth joined their party in Kansas City or St. Louis, and then 2 others met them in Denver, right? So all these women converged on Denver where they observed the eclipse with 3 telescopes and other equipment. Their telescopes got lost. They got left in a small town south of Denver called Pueblo. They didn't get them for 3 days. They got the telescopes just 2 days before the eclipse, or 2 or 3 days. So they had to scramble to set up their camp. So it was quite an event. But again, 6 women traveling together. They ended up on the day of the eclipse, the 29th of July, 1878. They set up their camp a couple miles outside of Denver on the Eastern Plains, had perfect skies. And there's really some spectacular photos that you can find on the web of Maria Mitchell's camp and these female astronomers. Some of them were just counting time. Some of them were making sketches. 3 of them were observing through the telescopes. But it may be another first. I don't know if this has ever been established, but she may have led the very first all-female eclipse expedition in history as well. So again, she's an amazing woman who had accomplished many firsts.
And it was only among women, it was only also among men because uh, this kind of field trip, Maria Mitchell was a pioneer because even in colleges for men, this kind of experience didn't happen.
Absolutely. I think it was quite a shock. Well, I shouldn't say shock because she was respected, and I don't think anyone laughed at her or made fun of them. She had a good reputation, but yes, it was very unusual, and those are the sorts of things that pave the way for future events, right? When you
Hmm.
have an all women's expedition for an eclipse, and women and men see that, it opens the road or the door for similar such events, whether astronomical expeditions or what have you. It opens that door for others down the road. And so again, an incredible pioneer.
By the way, Steve, have you, I assume you have already observed some total solar eclipses, right?
Yes, I have. The one in 2017, since I'm in Colorado, the one in 2017 went right north of us over Wyoming. So I took my own daughters, who were still pretty small, and they didn't know what was happening. We got up at 3 in the morning, and they just thought you know, it was an inconvenience for them until they saw the eclipse and they saw totality, and they thought it was the most amazing thing ever. So yeah, it's pretty spectacular.
Because I was reading that Maria Mitchell also instructed some of her students to observe how animals reacted to the eclipse. For example, if the dog stopped barking, if the ants stopped working, if the birds stopped singing. Can you tell a little bit about this reaction of animals to the eclipse?
Well, I'm not a biologist or a zoologist, but yes, I've read lots of accounts of eclipses, and in all cases, well, I shouldn't say all, but many examples of animals' odd behavior comes up. Again, I have heard actual cases talking about Thomas Edison where chickens returned home to roost. So maybe that really did happen to Thomas Edison. It wouldn't surprise me. Yes, Maria Mitchell did discuss that with her students, and I think lots of accounts of eclipses, especially from amateurs, meaning those who weren't, say, professional astronomers who were just watching the eclipse for the spectacle and noticing the world around them. They all talk about how this just strange hush, quietness happens during the time of the eclipse because the temperature just drops. Animals don't know what to do. Birds stop chirping. And then when the shadow passes a few minutes later and the sun comes back out, life comes back. It's almost um, yeah, it's almost as if there's this temporary pause just on on life, and everything sort of holds its breath. And you see that description time and time again, whether it's people or animals. So yeah, it's a really interesting observation. Maria Mitchell noticed it, and lots of others have too.
Excellent. Now let's move to our next question, which is, uh, well, I think we can skip the question for Thomas Edison because we have already talked about it. So the next question is, what was planet Vulcan and why were so many astronomers looking for it during the 1878 eclipse?
Sure. So planet Vulcan was a hypothetical planet that, well, the hypothesis was to solve a problem with the orbit of Mercury. So Mercury, of course, is the closest planet to the sun in our solar system. And Mercury has this strange sort of wobble in its orbit. And we won't go into too many details, but it's called a precession of perihelion. Perihelion is the point at which a planet is closest to the sun in its orbit. And usually that point is roughly the same for most planets, meaning if you were to sort of put a static view of the solar system, the planet's perihelion would be the same point each time. But Mercury's point of perihelion moved a little bit with each rotation. So it's a wobble, they called it. And the explanation was that maybe there is another planet inside the orbit of Mercury, even closer to the sun. And they named this hypothetical planet Vulcan. And something like that might explain why Mercury has this strange orbit. So the idea was Vulcan, if it existed, would be far too bright to see during the day. But you would have a chance to see it during a total solar eclipse when the moon is totally blocking the sun. If Vulcan exists, you might be able to see it on either side of the the disk of the moon, basically. But it's like looking for a needle in a haystack, which is, I think, is an expression that should translate across nation. You have a big stack of hay and you look for a tiny needle. It's hard. In this case, you didn't even know if the needle existed, because part of the problem, even if Vulcan existed, during an eclipse, it could be behind the sun or in front of the sun and blocked by the moon. So you just have this chance of maybe seeing it on either side for a couple minutes. But nevertheless, there were a few devout believers in planet Vulcan, or at least who hoped to find it, including Simon Newcomb, Lewis Swift, James C. Watson. And so that was their goal during the eclipse, was to search for Vulcan. And Watson believed he did find it. And they, for a few weeks after the eclipse, a lot of people considered that it had been found, but it didn't, of course, because we know now there is no planet Vulcan. And they probably just saw a star, a particular one they thought called A Cancri, I believe, or Theta Cancri. I can't remember which one, but anyway, it was probably a star that they saw. But they did believe that Vulcan existed, because they had no other way to explain the motion of Mercury. And of course, in 1915, Einstein's one of his talks on relativity, he disproved the need for Mercury. That was his test case, because he said, or for Vulcan, because he said Mercury's orbit can be explained by the heavy gravity of the sun curving space. And so, to make a long story short, Vulcan was this hypothetical planet, and it didn't exist, and now it only exists in Star Trek, I believe.
Yeah, so because I watched Star Trek, so the Star Trek Vulcan was inspired in this supposed planet, right?
Ooh, I like Star Trek, but I'm not that deep of a Trekkie, so I can't answer definitively. But it wouldn't surprise me if Gene Roddenberry got the name Vulcan from this hypothetical planet that many people thought must exist. So.
Okay, now we're going to perhaps our final question, which is the path of the 1878 eclipse went directly over the Rocky Mountains. What was the result of having so many astronomers observing from such high altitudes? How did this eclipse alter the direction of American astronomy?
Yeah, and that I think is the real interesting result of the 1878 eclipse. There was really no scientific breakthrough that came out of this eclipse. Had Vulcan been discovered, that might have been something. But I mean, it was an important eclipse, but it was like most others. But the really interesting aspect and the after effects of the 1878 eclipse was that this was the first time, really in history, that so many of the world's leading astronomers were observing from points that were really much above sea level. Right, as I said earlier, astronomy had always been positional, and so it's no surprise that most observatories were pretty close to wherever countries had their navies, right? Greenwich is at sea level, the US Naval Observatory is at sea level, most observatories were at sea level, and that because that's all that they needed. But of course, the higher you go, the more you get above the atmosphere, and the clearer your atmosphere, the less dense it is, the more you can see. So when you had all these astronomers observing from elevations that ranged from 5,000 feet in like the eastern parts of Colorado and Wyoming up to 14,000 feet, which is almost too high, as Samuel Langley found out. But all of these astronomers realized that they could see stars, and because they had their telescopes up, they weren't there just for the eclipse. They went out for a week or two, so they had this chance to look at stars, look at the moon, look at the planets, and they could see how much more clearly they could observe from higher elevations. And so after the eclipse of 1878, you really start to see a lot of observatories being built at higher altitudes. And now, throughout the 20th and into the 21st century, we know that it's taken for granted that the best observatories are going to be built at high altitudes, from Mauna Kea in Hawaii, Chile, some of these, very high elevations where the telescopes are put above as much of the atmosphere as possible. So, and I think that's the real lasting impact of the 1878 eclipse.
Very excellent. So, I have another question for you, which is about your biography. It
Uh-huh.
says you are a science fiction writer also. So, because when I was younger, I used to read many science fiction books, and I thought that they very exciting and interesting. And I'd like to ask you, what do you think is the role of science fiction in society?
I loved science fiction when I was a kid too, and I would read my science fiction and then go out and sleep outside and look up at the stars. Um, and I'm not the only one who feels this way. I know, because I have many friends who are some excellent science fiction authors, and I think we all believe that the sort of the imagination, the dreams that you can get from science fiction, both writing it and reading it, um, sort of give us that inspiration to imagine what it would be like to explore the stars, go to distant, solar systems or other star systems, and even other galaxies. And I think a lot of great scientists talk about how science fiction, things like Star Trek, Star Wars, impacted them as kids and made them want to study science. So I think it'd probably be hard to make a scientific connection between them, but I think if you talk to enough scientists, they all would say that I bet a lot of them would say that science fiction impacted them early on and sort of gave them these dreams and aspirations to reach for the stars, basically.
And can you show us one of your science fiction books?
Yes, absolutely. So here's a book I wrote. It's the first book in a trilogy. This book is called Prometheus Outbound, and in my science fiction universe, um, it's about 400 or 500 years from now, and humans have expanded through the galaxy, not the whole galaxy, but parts of it. And of course, as these things go, there's a sort of an evil empire, and my stories talk about a group of rebels who want to sort of throw off the iron shackles of tyranny, and they fight back, uh, as you see in a lot of other, a lot of science fiction stories have that sort of approach, that sort of trope, like Star Wars and stuff. So, but it's fun, and readers seem to like it, and it makes me happy that that
Yes,
I have a lot of fans. So,
very good. So maybe our viewers will be curious to know about this book and maybe read this book.
yeah.
And so we are going to the end of our interview. So I'd like Thank you very much, Steve, for being here today. And it's been very enriching. I learned a lot from you today, and I'm sure that our viewers also learn a lot, and that this podcast series will be, of course, for many, many years. And for many, many years, people will know about all the interesting details that you gave about the 1878 eclipse, which was one of most important eclipses in American history. So thank you very much for being here today, Steve.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure. I'm glad to be a part of it, and I think this podcast series you're doing is excellent and a really great resource. So thank you for having me to be part of it.
Thank you. So now I'm gonna call my partner, Dr. Sybeck. I'll call him David from now on to make a closing for our podcast for today.
Uh, Hi, this is David Sybeck here. I'm a scientist in the United States, and I think you'll all agree that this was a wide-ranging and fascinating interview that touched on ever so many topics. As Steve mentioned, many of us who do science today were motivated by science fiction and the early discoveries. In the 60s, I remember very clearly the landing on the moon, and I remember Star Trek from episode 1 all the way through. We watched those religiously every night in my house. I think what I find absolutely fascinating in this interview is in the early modern era, how people were now ready to treat eclipses scientifically, to go and see them. Many people were interested. Of course, the general public could also be aware of them because we have the ability to predict and spread that knowledge. So some people would just go as part of science vacation or science tourism. And equally interesting to me is the impact of the eclipse back on society, the way that it impacted women in science, the way that it led to a raising of the general science level in the United States, the way that it caused people to try to observe it with new instruments in new locations, to go out and be in the field rather than staying at home. All of these are trends that subsequently develop in our society until we reach the modern time. And it's true, in the modern time, people are equally interested in going on expeditions to see eclipses, bringing highly sophisticated instruments. But here we see it at the inception, the ability to get there. There were trains that could get you there. You could make it. You could see it yourself if you wanted, and scientists did. So this is the second in our series of programs about eclipses. There are many more interesting ones to come along too. I hope viewers will come back and see the other ones. Thank you, Norma, and thank you, Steve, for your interview today.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.